you have to make an effort to do it because they are usually at 11 or 12,000 feet, a place like Sandia Crest Mountain in New Mexico, where at Sandia Crest, the birds congregate in the winter at an altitude of 11,000 feet. And that, as we all know, is going to be an issue because of climate change. Tonight, Dr. Garth Spellman, who is Curator of Ornithology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, is joining us to talk about this topic. Dr. Spellman has a great long resume. I'll give you a few little nuggets. He grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, which ironically is where our North Dakota trip is in June, where we start. His first summer job, I love this, was a lab assistant pinning beetle specimens in a paleontology lab. He spent 2 years at the National Science Foundation and so on. But most importantly, in terms of tonight's program, his research focuses on how recent and ancient environmental changes have affected bird species. That's why he's with us tonight, and we are honored. Dr. Spellman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I love talking about what I do, and I enjoy sharing my passion for birds, of course, with people who share that passion. So thank you so much for turning out tonight. It's always a pleasure. It'd be nice if we were in person. So it's always good to see faces. So when I give this talk, I get to look at my slides like you do. So I apologize for that. But we will get started and jump in. So let me start sharing my screen here. Oh man, it's asking me to.
We've been here.
We've been down this road, haven't we?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
All right. So it should give me permission now to do that. It's my museum firewall. They don't want me sharing everything.
We're
I
good.
don't understand. Excellent. And there we go. So you can all see that now.
Yep.
So I started working on Rosy-Finches when I came to the museum, which has now been 7.5 years ago. And it started with a desire to, work on one of the most iconic and endemic species that's restricted to the Southern Rocky Mountains. And that, of course, there are very few species that are like that, and the Rosy-Finch is one, because it breeds in very high elevation, almost exclusively above 11,000 feet in elevation. And very rarely does it come down to lower elevations unless there is, a disturbance or a storm that drives them down to lower elevations around feeders. So I know somebody from Colorado was talking beforehand that they haven't seen many Rosy-Finches this year. And that's very much true across the state. We haven't had really many pronounced and long storms that have driven those brown-capped Rosy-Finches down to lower elevation. There's still a lot of exposed vegetation, and they're able to find food if that's the case. So it doesn't drive them down to those lower elevations. We're seeing more of the black and the gray-crowned Rosy-Finches this year, but even so, it's fewer than in previous years. So, but one of the things I really love about my work is I get to work in some beautiful places. So this is the snowy range in southern Wyoming that you can see here on one of our field trips while we were catching Rosy-Finches for this particular project. So I'm just going to talk about my work, and I'm just going to start out with a summary of what I study. So I'm really interested in how climate or climatic shifts and landscape changes actually drive evolutionary change that we see in populations and in species. So one of the things I'm interested in is how it drives phylogenetic diversity, and that is the generation of species and proliferation of species over time. I'm also interested in how those shifts in climate and landscape changes, how can contribute to hybrids and how hybrids are formed on the landscape. So I have a project right now where we're looking at how urbanization across the Front Range in Colorado is increasing hybridization between flickers, red and yellow shafted flickers, and also increasing hybridization between eastern and western house wrens. So that's another project that I work on. And because I'm interested in that, I'm interested in how birds become species and what drives that generation of species. And then I'm also interested in how those climatic shifts and landscape changes drive community genetics and how species interact with one another across the landscape. And from that, we call that sort of top-down effects of diversity. So how climate shifts can lead to zoonotic diseases, for example, that move into naive populations, and how those populations deal with novel pathogens within their environment. So that's also something that I work on. So because I'm interested in climate change, we have to try and answer some quick questions as we start to get into this study. And how is it that how is climate change affecting birds? And we can talk about it first on a global scale. Well, globally, birds are in trouble. You probably have heard about this. So especially if you read any Audubon magazines, you know this for sure. And if you've been to talks, which I'm sure your Audubon Society is putting on, but we have about 48% of bird species are experiencing worrisome declines. Many have lost in excess of 60% of their population within the last 60 years. Now you think about that in terms of human population, you know, imagine a city of Chicago losing 60% of its population across 50 years, and what kind of catastrophic effects that would have upon society. Now, this is true even if we look across a more regional scale. If you look in North America, we see a loss of 2.9 billion birds gone in 50 years. And that is sheer biomass. So that is even healthy species like the American robin, that have lost, you know, a huge portion of their population in the last 50 years. There are some groups and some ecosystems or biomes where this trend is being bucked, but it's pretty much across the board if we look across every biome. So from eastern forest birds, a loss of 17%, and then all the way down to grassland birds at a loss of 53% in North America alone in the last 50 years. It's having a devastating effect, and we know that there are certain drivers that are causing these dramatic declines. I can't even show you what alpine tundra looks like, because alpine tundra birds, we simply just don't know how much loss we have in the last few years, because surveys have not been good enough to really record those declines in those areas. Now, what are these declines due to? Now, as you can imagine, most of these changes and most of these declines are actually due to human-caused disturbances. So this is from the same study that was showing a loss of 60% of many populations of birds on a global scale. And so the number one contributor to impacts and threats is biological resource use, and that's human biological resource use on the landscape. Number two is agriculture. And then number three is that's driving species populations down, is considered to be climate change and extreme weather. But I want you to just take a quick note of one thing on that, because if you look at the categories of impacts on the bottom here, the gray is unknown, meaning we don't know what impact that is having on populations. The others are medium, low to high classes of impact. So we understand how agriculture is affecting avian populations. We know that if you clear cut an area and you grow a monoculture, that right is catastrophic for diversity across that area. So we know how landscape changes are affecting that. Our problem is with climate change is we don't know exactly how it's affecting populations. We don't know what kind of impact it's going to have in the future. And so each system and each species that we study could be susceptible in different ways. And unless we study those species in depth, we're not going to truly understand the sort of future that they might have in the face of future climate change. And so that's really what this study is about. And so I'm going to talk today about climate change and how it has contributed to the origin of rosy-finches in North America and across the globe. And it has the potential to lead to the decline of an iconic Colorado and Southern Rocky Mountain species. And so that's going to be the focus of the rest of the talk. But I want you to recognize before I get into it that this is a huge undertaking. Rosy-finches are not easy to study, especially where they breed. And so this is a very large collaborative project. So those of you who have been to Sandia have gone with Raymond Buskirk, so to look at those birds. And it has involved many people from multiple institutions. And so I just want you to recognize their work that has gone into this. I am by no means the only one doing this work. And so we have to recognize their contributions as well. Now, the brown-capped rosy-finch, the one that we have here in Colorado, gets into New Mexico and also southern Wyoming, is a species that we identify as a chionophile. They're an organism that thrive in cold and winter conditions. The birds, the species, it breeds almost exclusively above 12,000 feet. It does get into a few lower mountain ranges within Colorado, but they have to meet certain conditions. There has to be natural lakes. Oftentimes there has to be summer snowfields because they forage on snowfields in the alpine tundra during the breeding season. Their primary source of food when they are feeding young is insects that are gleaned off of snowfields. And so oftentimes you will see large groups of them that are gathered together on snowfields that are just adjacent to alpine lakes because prevailing winds kind of blow the insects onto that snowfield. And so you'll see them congregating in those areas where they're gathering food for their young. And then in the winter, they will come down to lower elevations, but only if conditions are met. So the storm that we are having right now is supposed to affect all of Colorado. And most likely you will see rosy-finches, probably brown-capped rosy-finches, at elevations around 8,000 feet if you have feeders, because they do feed on black oil seed and other seeds during the non-breeding season. And so they have a very restricted distribution. You can see their distribution here in this image. If you could see my little arrow, this is a projection of rosy-finch, brown-capped rosy-finch distribution. That is their breeding range within Colorado, northern New Mexico, and southern Wyoming. That's what those white borders are right there across. Now, the populations down in northern New Mexico, they haven't detected breeding birds down there in the last decade. So at this point, we don't know if there are breeding populations in northern New Mexico. There have been some recent surveys that haven't detected them during the breeding season, which might suggest, if you think about climate change and having an effect at lower latitudes first, those birds might already have been extirpated from those mountain ranges in the breeding season in northern New Mexico. Now, brown-capped rosy-finches aren't our only rosy-finches. In fact, there is a species that's found in Asia. It's this kind of rather dull one that's right here with the orange bar underneath it in the picture. And its distribution in Asia includes Kamchatka, so far eastern Siberia, and then also the tall mountains of northern Mongolia and northern China. And so that is the Asian species of rosy-finch. You need to include it if we're going to talk about the species and how they became to be and were generated. And you also have gray-crowned rosy-finches, multiple what we call in museum world and in taxonomy subspecies of gray-crowned rosy-finch, those that are out on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and the Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea. And then you have two subspecies of gray-crowned rosy-finch that are part of the continental populations, those here on the coast and then in the interior of Alaska, and then a couple other subspecies in the high Sierras when you get into California. The black blob there, that's the distribution of the black rosy-finch, and then the gray-crowned rosy, or the brown-capped rosy-finch is down here to the southeast. Now, those blobs don't give it justice, because if you actually look at the distribution of the species, that's what these red markings are here in the inset map. That's the limit of their breeding distribution. And so even though the blobs look rather big on the map, their distribution where they do breed is much, much smaller than what it looks like. So you have quite a bit of diversity within this radiation. And they're really quite beautiful birds, as you can see. Now, if we talk about climate change and habitat loss, rosy finches are among the species that stand to lose the most. This is from an actual Audubon-sponsored study that looked at plotting the ecological niches of these species into the future using climate projections that was published back in 2015. And so if you look at 2020, they were supposed to have a certain percentage of their habitat left. So in 2020, based on this study in 2015, the black rosy finch was supposed to only have 3% of its habitat left based on this projection. We are past 2020, in case any of you noticed. It is now 2023, and the black rosy finch has not lost 70% of its habitat as of now. So these projections that were done back in 2015, they were pretty dramatic and pretty scary, but they weren't entirely accurate just based on the methods that they were using back then. And our ability to predict climate change and changes has improved dramatically since then. So that's part of what I'm going to talk about today, is improving upon these projections and what we think might happen to species in the future. So these are some of the questions that I'm going to try and get at today. So how has a cyanophile, right, adapted to a changing world? We're going to look at over time. First thing we need to find out is the brown-capped rosy finch that we have here in the southern Rocky Mountains. Is it distinct from other rosy finch species? As a field ornithologist, you know that it's considered a species separate from the black rosy finch and the gray-crowned rosy finch, according to taxonomists right now. There's a small problem with that, though, because genetic studies have not been able to find any differences between these three species. And these are studies that have been conducted over the last 30 years. So is it distinct? If so, how, why, when did it come to be? And so we're hopefully going to answer that question today. Next, I want to talk about how connected the populations within the southern Rocky Mountains on these sky island habitats, how connected are they today? and were they in the past, and can we make predictions about it in the future? And then I also want to finally talk about, is the species at risk of decline environmentally and genetically? Because these predictions that were made back in 2015 suggests that the species should already have lost approximately 50% of its breeding range at this point. And so we're going to talk about all this today. And so I just want to take you through what it means and how we work with these species, with the species in its environment. This is another one of my field sites. It's beautiful. You can see that beautiful snow field on the side of the lake, and that's where we go to catch them. You can also see other lakes in the background, and you can see other snow fields, and it's really a beautiful area to work. I've had the privilege of taking interns and teens up into the field with me, and lots of assistants have helped with this work. So part of our mission at the museum is also to change the face of science in the future, to be more representative of society at whole. And so we have a program taking underrepresented interns into the field with us. So that's one of my groups from 2017. And when we went up into the mountains, when we were first working on this project, we had to devise a way to capture rosy-finches. And so we were using multiple methods. The first thing we did was we tried to set up mist nets up in these rock fields and these snow fields. So that's what we're doing right here. And if any of you have ever been up in alpine tundra, mist nets are really hard to erect in this setting. Not only are they really hard to put up, of course, they make me happy. So you can see me smiling, and you can see the mist net there to try and catch the birds. But wind is often a problem. So you can see this mist net billowing in the wind. And then as soon as the sun shines on those mist nets, they're very easily seen. And sort of the trick behind a mist net is you don't want the birds to see it. You want it in a shady area where the birds will not see that the mist net is there and fly in. So we were trying to catch these birds coming onto this large snow field here in our mist nets, and it didn't work out so well when we first started out on this project. We did catch a few birds. So there are also violet green swallows and pipits that nest up in these areas. And so we caught quite a few swallows. They seem to go into our nets just fine. But after we had our nets up on this first trip up, we actually had rosy-finches that perched on top of our mist nets. And so we were not really able to catch them very well. So we went to another method, and that's using these potter traps. And so you might see on the side here, there's a little trap door that actually props up. And then there's this little lever, that hammer right there, that's connected to a foot pad at the bottom of the potter trap. And so you prop that door up, and you bait the trap with seed underneath the trap. And when the rosy-finch, which you can see right here, which is in the trap, walks in and gets to the seed, it stands on the foot pad, which releases the trap, and the door closes. And this works very effectively if you have patience and time. The first thing you need to do is you need to go up onto the snowfields, and you need to bait for a couple of days to get the rosy-finches used to having seeds in their environment where they're normally adjusted or adapted to collecting insects. So you bait for a while, and then you have to put the trap on top of the bait where they've been feeding for the last couple of days. But once they're assimilated to that being in their environment, it's actually really quite easy to catch the rosy-finches. It's not without problems. You might see here. So this was a small rock slide, and you can see where it came down, and somehow, I'm not sure the probability of this, if there's any, physicist out there who wants to talk to me about this, or geologist, but this boulder just so happened to follow the exact plane and route to crash into our otter traps on this particular snowfield. It's pretty amazing. We were lucky and fortunate. We didn't have any rosy-finches in there at the time, but it was absolutely just, I don't know, it made me laugh. So it's not without problems. We work in some other areas. So this is on top of Pikes Peak, and you may not notice, so Pikes Peak is very different. Oftentimes in the middle of summer during the breeding season, the snow is entirely gone. And so there are lakes down at the bottom of this cliffside, but you have to get the birds where they nest. And so they nest in these crags and these cliff faces. And so you have to bait down at the bottom. So our trap is actually right there. You might be able to see someone here. And so we have to use ropes and other gear to get down to these sites in order to put the traps out in their environment. So here you can see Joel, one of our field assistants. Trap is right here on the boulder above him, and he's picking up some rosy-finches that were in that trap at that time. So once we get the birds, we bag them and we record data, the date. We get bands on them. So we affix a USGS band with a unique number on it. And at the time, we were also color banding the birds, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. What's nice about a ornithologist who's also a father, I have 3 boys. That's my son right there, who loved to go, and because he got all sorts of snacks, granola bars, and he's helping out record data. So, but once we get the birds, that's what you can see. So here's a brown-capped rosy-finch. You can see the USGS band right here on its left leg. On its right leg, we put on that gold color band, and that tells us about the mountain range that the bird was on. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. You can see some really interesting color variation. They're not always exclusively rosy. That rose color can be partially determined by genetics. We've actually figured out the genes that are responsible for that coloration, but it also is due to diet. So if they're not getting the proper carotenoids or pigments through their diet, sometimes they can deposit sort of orangish color instead of rosy colors into their plumage. So you can see that in the bird. And then we also take blood. So this is me with a very small gauge needle, and birds just like us, they've got a brachial vein that comes across their elbow. They have transparent skin, so it's really easy to see it. And so you move the feathers apart and you do a little venipuncture with that needle, and you're able to capture a little bit of blood for genetic studies. And that's the kind of work that I do in my lab. And so once we get this blood from the birds, and after we've banded them and studied and measured them, we can start to ask questions. And so we did this with all rosy-finch species, from the Asian rosy-finch, gray-crowned rosy-finch, black rosy-finch, and brown-capped rosy-finch. And in order to determine whether or not our brown-capped rosy-finch are a distinct species, we sequenced 68 rosy-finch genomes, so all of their DNA, to look and say, okay, are these birds, these species, distinct? And so this is what we call genomics. And why is it? Why do we use genomics? Well, it's the study of all the DNA in an organism, and bird genomes have on average about 1.1 to 1.3 million base pairs. So they have 1.3 million A, T, C's, and G's that can tell us a lot about their ecological and evolutionary history. Their genomes are very different than ours, however. They have macrochromosomes, microchromosomes, and they also have sex-linked chromosomes. But the top karyotype up here, that's humans. And the bottom one here is a zebra finch. And you can see zebra finch genomes are very different. They've got these tiny microchromosomes, and they change very differently than our giant big chromosomes. And then also birds are different because their sex chromosomes are Z and W. And in birds, the females are actually the heterochromatic species or sex. So females have a ZW and males have a ZZ in their genome, whereas in humans, they're XY. And so they have some pretty interesting genomic composition. But you might ask, okay, why are we looking at their DNA? Why can't we just study their plumage and their morphology and tell us about their history? Well, I wish I could see you, because then I could ask, who out there has tried any of these genome history studies? Who's tried 23andMe or Ancestry DNA? Anyone listening? Raise your hand. So, but I know lots of people who have done this. And when you look at it, if you get enough of your DNA, you can start to look at your family history, and that's your evolutionary history, your places of origin, where your ancestors moved across the landscape. And so evolutionary and ecological history is written into the genome. And we've figured out in the genomic era how to read these chromosomes to tell us about the history of life on the planet. And so that's why we use DNA to tell these stories. Now, these services, if you've ever tried them before, they look at about 600,000 sites, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms across the genome. And when we're looking at the Rosy-Finch, our data, we're looking at 6 to 9 million variable sites. So these are sites that vary between individuals, populations, and species. And so we can get a pretty detailed picture of the history of the species over time. So I am not going to go into great detail on genomics for you, because that would bore you, and we would get to about 10 o'clock. And you'd wonder why you came to this genomics talk. So I'm going to sort of talk about it at a 30,000 foot level and about things that we have learned. Well, one of the first things we learned is we look at the evolution of the species complex, and that is all the Rosy-Finches. And what the DNA tells us is that Rosy-Finches across the Northern Hemisphere have diverged, they have speciated, so with gene flow since the last glacial maximum. Now, all that gene flow means is that once they became unique or diverged, there were individuals still moving between species and reproducing. So that contributed to genetic diversity later on after that divergence occurred. And so we know that a lot has happened since the last glacial maximum, because the hemisphere looked like this during the last glacial maximum. And during the time, where were the Rosy-Finches? At all high elevation areas and high latitude areas, Rosy-Finch habitat 15,000 years ago was covered in ice. And so we didn't have Rosy-Finches where they would normally be. And so if you look at their evolutionary tree that we get from genomic data, we see that the earliest species in this group is that Asian Rosy-Finch. So Rosy-Finches up until the last glacial maximum occurred in an area that you might have heard of called, Beringia, which was part of Alaska and northeastern Siberia down into further western Siberia. And that is probably where this radiation of birds originated, was in that area. That's where the oldest species in this complex is. And we are able to date some of these divergences, and you don't get a rosy finch in North America proper until about 25,000 years ago. And the first species to arise are actually those groups that are out on the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands. So these are islands out in the middle of the ocean, the Pacific Ocean and the Bering Sea, that were not glaciated during the last glacial maximum. So you had an Asian rosy finch, you had these gray-crowned rosy finches out on these islands. And then it wasn't until the glaciers started to recede and the planet warmed up that you started to have rosy finches that migrated into North America. And they radiated very quickly. All these branches you see on this evolutionary tree leading to continental rosy finches, black rosy finch, and the brown-capped rosy finch, all those speciation events have happened most likely within the last 15 to 20,000 years. And climate change was essential. The warming of the planet actually opened up these new habitats, these high elevation habitats in the southern parts of North America, just freeing them up for colonization of rosy finches. And as a result, that's how we get the diversity that we see today. So we talk about climate change in our era as having a negative impact on this species. Well, in the past, climate change contributed to the origin of this radiation of birds that we find in North America, and this amazing radiation that we see today. So I just want to reiterate that in 2 studies that have been published within the last 2 years, we actually show that climate change since the last glacial maximum was critical to the evolution of the brown-capped rosy finch. And the species has rapidly adapted to high elevation. And that continued immigration from gray-crowned rosy finches and black rosy finches, although hasn't swamped out the brown-capped rosy finch. It hasn't prevented that species from being unique, but it has been essential to maintaining diversity within brown-capped rosy finches and essential to maintaining the adaptive potential within the species, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more now. And so the second thing we wanted to look at is, okay, we identify brown-capped rosy finch. We can see that it's genetically different. How connected are populations today? And that's what brings us to those little color bands, because our original plan was to use color bands and use field ornithologists and birders to spot these color bands to see if we could look at movements between breeding sites and wintering sites. So all the birds that we captured were banded with a particular color band in the field. And that meant that that bird was found on one particular mountain range and captured there in the breeding season. So if you saw it in the winter with a blue band, we know that bird. We know that bird was banded on one mountain range. It's moved here in the winter, and maybe it'll move back in the summer. So we were hoping to use observations. It didn't work that well. We had to use these iodized bands, these metal bands, because the plastic bands that you would attach can fall off easily after a season. And so we thought the metal bands would be great. The problem is brown-capped rosy finches live in such an extreme and harsh environment. They're always on these rocks. That's where they breed. They scraped those bands clean of any paint that was on them. And so we were left with a bird that had 2 silver bands. on its leg. We did get, I think over the course of 4 years, I think we had a total of 13 resightings where we could tell the color of the band. And we banded hundreds upon hundreds of birds. So that didn't work. So again, I had to resort to genomics to the rescue. And so we went to a lot of breeding ranges across Colorado and southern Wyoming. We captured as many birds as we could. We took blood samples from them, and we again sequenced their whole genomes to look at how these populations may be connected to one another. And so what we do is we have to dilute all that variation you see in the genome down to a simple image that you can see and understand. And so basically, I want you to look at those shotgun images on the right of the screen. And anytime you see balls that move away from the rest of the cluster, that means that those are genetically different than the others that are all clustered together. And the first thing that pops out here that we see is Pikes Peak. And Pike, if anyone's ever been to Colorado, been on Pikes Peak, this is an island out on the Eastern Plains. It's the furthest 14er to the east in Colorado. And it juts up, and it's a magnificent peak. But it's not surprising. So those birds are pretty far removed from other breeding populations within Colorado. And so we see, because of that, that their genetics start to move them away from others, suggesting that there might be limited contact between birds on Pikes Peak and those in other parts of Colorado. Then the next two populations, one is the Snowy Range. That's that mountain range in southern Wyoming. They are different than the others. And then a little crag out in the far northwestern part of the distribution of brown-capped rosy-finches, Devil's Causeway, and that's another peripheral population. So if we look at this population structure, looking at the genomics, it tells us that peripheral populations are most likely at risk of local extinction. They're genetically different, and you may not have birds moving between them and other populations that are connected via high elevation. This is not too surprising. We see this often with birds that are part of island systems, often the most isolated, most peripheral of islands, and the smallest islands are those that are most genetically distinct. It's a phenomenon known as island biogeography. We know this is a phenomenon, and so it's not so surprising that we see this. Now, how about, can we answer how these birds might react to future climate change? And again, we use genomics to try and address this question. Now, I talked about before a 2015 study by Audubon that showed that the brown-capped rosy-finch by 2020 should have lost approximately 50% of its habitat and its breeding range by 2020. Now, we know that that hasn't occurred. The populations may be declining. That is certainly a possibility, but we know that they occur across pretty much the same range. So is there a way that we can use genetics to help us infer what might happen to this species in the future? And so my colleagues and I have devised a modeling method, and this is a very complicated slide. I'm not going to go into it too much, but if you follow the right side of this slide, this is the method, this occurrence, using occurrence records to make an ecological niche model and project that into the future. This is the method that Audubon was using back in 2015 to make their predictions about how birds would shift and change and respond to climate change. We actually are using population structure and a gene by environment association to look at how future populations may be maladapted to future conditions or to future conditions. So we look at current populations and how genetic structure may be shaped by current adaptation. And so that's what we're doing. And so all that we are calculating is something that we call genomic offset. And what that offset means is that a local population, if we look in the future, is maladapted to future conditions. So it means that a population is currently locally adapted to current conditions. And in the future, those current conditions that exist may disappear. And so that population that is in that location is not adapted to what the future conditions are like. And so we use this to predict where locally or where adapted populations may be in the future and whether or not those populations can move across the landscape. So the idea is that the species needs to move, adapt in situ in the location that it's in, or die in response to future climate change. And so when we make projections about genomic offset, that's what this map looks like here. And you can see a lot of yellow and red in this projection. That is populations that are going to have the most extreme genomic offset in the future. And then we use this in combination with projections of future niches to look at what is going on and where the species could potentially be in the future. So if you look at this map right here, the top two maps, this is showing the niche model, essentially what you would get from the Audubon study from 2015. We modified it a little bit because we're using modern projections of what future climate change was going to be. And so if you go to 2050, that's what this projection is on the right-hand side. That is a projection in 2050 of the habitat that will exist for rosy-finches in 2050, compared to their current range, which are the white outlines right there. If we account for genomic offset and we account for where future conditions are going to meet the genetic disposition of modern day populations, that's what the bottom projection is here for 2050. And so what our projection suggests is that you have a tiny area in the southwestern Southern Rockies and in the central Southern Rockies, two areas where future populations are not going to be maladapted to future conditions. And so those are the only areas that are actually going to have environmental conditions necessary to support their currently locally adapted populations. And so these birds are going to be faced with the need to move around their environment in the future because the habitat is likely not there to support them. So what does it all mean? You know, how will brown-capped rosy-finches fare in the face of climate change? Well, I want to talk about the positives first, because I think we always need that, right? Climate change has been essential in the evolution of the species. The species has shown remarkable adaptive potential in the recent past. And current populations actually appear mostly connected. and rather stable. So that dire prediction that was made by Audubon in the past, it didn't account for the fact that these birds are moving. As long as there are corridors for them to move, they are moving around, exchanging genetic material, and their adaptive potential because of that is pretty strong. The concerns, our models, indicate future suitable habitat almost non-existent, and only 2 areas where current populations are adapted to those future conditions. So unless individuals from those areas move, it's extremely likely that the populations will experience catastrophic decline. But, with conservation and with, efforts to preserve the species, we may be able to help them move across that landscape. So I just want to thank a bunch of people, bunch of places, and I know that there's lots of people online and there may be questions, and I covered a lot of complicated things. So I would love to answer any questions if there are any out there, and I'll show my face again for myself.
Thank you, Garth. Yes, there are questions and questions and questions. So let me start here. This was early, like I think the second slide. What do you mean when you refer to biological? This is from Bob Stanley. What do you mean when you refer to biological resource use as having an impact on bird survival? Please give an example or 2.
So biological resource use, of course, is going to be deforestation, those types of things. Anytime we are modifying the landscape and using the resources that are there, that is what biological resource use is. It's separated in that particular paper. They separate that from agriculture because that is prolonged use of those areas for a very specific purpose. Agriculture, whether it's ranching or planting of crops. So that is what we're talking about. I mean, that's the easiest example that I can provide. You go someplace where there's forest species, you cut down the trees to use for human resources, then it's no longer suitable habitat for those species that once occupied that area.
Okay, I think Sunny's question you probably answered already in the middle. Since you banned the birds, with what frequency are the banded birds rediscovered? 13 times.
Well, so there were actually a lot more resightings than 13. It's just the majority that were resighted, you couldn't tell what color the band was.
Yeah.
But the question is moot.
Yes.
Okay. Ilana, since you handle the birds, do they have any diseases or parasites that are transmittable to humans?
Not to humans, but another colleague of mine and I, we just got a paper accepted last week that is looking at avian malaria in Rosy-Finches. So because we're taking blood samples and we're looking at the DNA of their blood-borne parasites are also found in their blood. And so we were looking at how common avian malaria is in Rosy-Finches. And it may not come as a shock to you, but the occurrence of malaria in Rosy-Finches is directly related to the insect vectors that you find in their environment. So it's highly correlated to whether or not they occur in an environment where you have midges versus mosquitoes and the types of malaria that they get. We can't get avian malaria. Human malaria, or malaria itself, originated in birds probably 100 million years ago. It probably was found in dinosaurs before that. And it got into mammals after it diversified in birds. So there are very few malarial parasites that actually infect mammals. There's probably over 370 species of malaria that affect birds worldwide.
Okay, thank you. Bob Stanley again, what physiological what physiologic changes distinguish high altitude rosy finches from birds that live at much lower altitudes, like Denver or Chicago? I don't know.
So that's another interesting. So we have another paper that was just accepted that is looking at rosy finches and how they became rosy and how they got gray crowns and how they adapted to high elevation at the genetic level. And so what we've been able to find are the genes that control for whether a bird has a gray crown or a gray ear, as well as a crown. And then for elevation, what's interesting in brown-capped rosy finches, the loss of a gray crown is linked to some genes that are tied to adaptation to high elevation. And so that might be a way that the species in a way can choose a mate that might be more fit for its environment. So it's one of those random things in evolution where you can link a visual characteristic to something that might have a fitness benefit. Because birds in Colorado, the brown-capped rosy finches are adapted to high elevation. And so what we find is the loss of a gray crown, which you also have in the black-crowned rosy finch, in the brown-capped rosy finch, appears to be linked somehow to genes to oxygen affinity, to get more oxygen in an area where the partial pressure of oxygen is lower because you're at high elevation.
When you say that they're losing their crowns, this is specific individuals?
No, this is the species.
Oh, overall.
Yep, overall. And so those two characteristics somehow became linked in their evolutionary history, and it might be due to adaptation to high elevation.
Okay. Okay, Alana, again, all this laboratory and genetic testing is expensive. How are these excursions or studies funded? Is there any corporate business involvement at all?
So through multiple means. We have had great partnerships with Colorado Parks and Wildlife that are interested in understanding these questions. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we get a little funding from. National Science Foundation has contributed money. And we have had generous donations also from private donors.
John Marion, will the rosy finches likely migrate due to warming climate to more northern locations like Canada?
I would love to say yes. I can't make that prediction. I think one of the take-home messages is that although some of the predictions are dire, movement of individuals, right, has been very important for the history of the species and the species complex. So I think that we will still have rosy finches in the future. I don't know if there'll be brown-capped rosy finches. So we may potentially lose them in the Southern Rockies. So, and at this point, if we don't turn things around, but we will have rosy finches. I don't know what that will look like. Oftentimes instability in environment contributes to, like what I talked about at the very beginning, to hybridization. So species hybridize with one another when there are fewer individuals and when there are disturbances in the environment that make it difficult for them to encounter, right, the perfect pair. And so oftentimes you see a reshuffling of genetic material that can contribute to future adaptation in a disturbed environment. Maybe that's what we'll see in rosy finches. It's possible. I can't say for sure. But I guess I want to be eternally hopeful. I want this species to be there in the future. For my kids who've seen them when they were very young, to be able to go up in the mountains when they're older and share that with their children would be nice.
Okay, we have a few more. I'm going to try to get through them because you've been very generous with your time. Wanda is asking, how do wildfires move or affect populations of brown-capped rosy-finches?
Well, since they occur in the summer, they don't, oftentimes a wildfire, right? The smoke that's coming off a wildfire will move up and away. It doesn't often affect, especially the alpine tundra areas as much as you might think. As far as we know from the surveys that have been done, breeding birds that are found in areas affected by wildfire at lower elevation, they don't leave during that time. But of course, if it's an extreme wildfire, we can't send people out to do surveys in areas, so we don't know exactly if it's really bad what happens.
Okay. Tom is asking, is species adaptation slower than habitat change? Do we know?
I think that's a question that you could say yes and no to. It depends on the species. Habitats do change very quickly. Species do adapt if they have the potential, but it requires genetic diversity. If you lose genetic diversity and habitats change, species will not be able to react. And that's why maintaining healthy population size is imperative.
The next two, and then I have one last one. Next two are really more comments, and Ruth is saying that if you look at, okay, the Rio Grande Bird Research Inc. posted a report on their Facebook page this week. They banded a gray-capped rosy finch for the third time. She's 8 years old. So she has a Facebook link. If anyone wants to cancel it, it's in the chat. And Bob is just commenting that this is a pessimistic comment, but despite their adaptive history, it seems nearly inconceivable that the finches might be able to adapt successfully in the short time frame of 50 or 100 years. So we'll see. I have one question, and then I'm going to let everybody, Sunny will unmute everybody so we can say thank you. So we've been talking about brown-capped rosy finches, but in general, have the 3 North American rosy finch species declined? I mean, you talked about habitat loss. It wasn't as bad as we thought, but what are the numbers showing?
They are faring as well as other North American species. They have declined significantly in the last 50 years. We don't know about brown caps. Those surveys are still being done by Colorado Parks and Wildlife to get numbers, because when they started doing focused surveys on brown-capped rosy finches, their population numbers were much greater than what was originally anticipated. Because people hadn't been up at high elevation during the breeding season looking in a scientific way, a rigorous way at the populations. So they're reassessing what their original population estimates should have been. And I think only future surveys are going to tell us whether or not we're seeing declines.
Thank you. All right, Sunny, you want to unmute everybody? Garth, I want to thank you. It was, first of all, you can't, like, everyone loves rosy finches, so that is not to be denied, and it's a very sad situation. Hopefully, as you said, it won't be as bad as we think, but I really appreciate your sharing your incredible research with us.
Yeah,
and
great.
It was just a really interesting topic, of course, but a great conversation and insight. So I want to thank you and thank everyone for coming. Yay!
Hey, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, and I'll be back in touch.